Nightmarish Part 1, The Whispered Legend. At the end of Thornton Lane, where the streetlights seemed too afraid to shine, stood a house cloaked in legend and shadow. The Laughing House, they called it, a name whispered in hushed tones at the local pub, often accompanied by uneasy glances and a hurried change of subject. The house wasn't merely abandoned, it radiated a presence, an oppressive weight that made the air feel colder, the shadows darker. Thorny ivy crawled up its cracked walls, almost as if nature itself was trying to strangle the life, or whatever remained out of it. The windows were blackened, as though the house refused to let light in or out, and its sagging roof seemed to bow under the weight of its sinister history. The origins of the Laughing House's curse were murky at best. Some claimed it began centuries ago when the land was used for public executions. Others pointed to the arrival of the Morgan family 30 years ago as the true genesis of its infamy. Edward Morgan, a brilliant but eccentric architect, had designed the house himself. A masterpiece of spiraling staircases and hidden passageways, a place as much puzzle as home. To outsiders, the Morgans were the picture of domestic bliss. Edward, with his sharp suits and sharper mind, Margaret, his poised and elegant wife, and their two children, Jonathan and Emily, who were always dressed immaculately, as if posed for a portrait. But perfection has a way of cracking under pressure, and the Morgans' cracks began to show. Neighbours heard things, strange things, laughter, but not the joyous kind. It was hollow, twisted, echoing in the dead of night. Some claimed they saw lights flickering on and off, even when the family wasn't home. The mailman swore he felt eyes watching him whenever he approached the property, though no one was ever at the window. The turning point came one stormy night. The Morgans had been seen entering the house earlier in the evening. By all accounts, they were cheerful, as if nothing in the world could go wrong. Yet by morning, the house was silent. Too silent. When the police were finally called to investigate, they found the house empty. Not just devoid of the Morgans, but eerily untouched. Dinner plates sat half-filled on the dining table. A fire still smouldered in the hearth, as if someone had just stoked it, and the rocking chair in the living room swayed gently, despite there being no draught. But the most chilling discovery was on the wall of the living room. Written in a substance that no forensic test could identify was a message, scrawled in jagged, almost desperate handwriting. "We're laughing now. Join us if you dare." The Morgans were never seen again. The house quickly earned its reputation. No one dared move in, and even the most fearless thrill-seekers rarely stayed long. Those who ventured inside came out pale and shaking, babbling about disembodied whispers, icy touches on their skin, and that unmistakable laughter echoing in places it shouldn't. And so the Laughing House sat, its doors sealed shut but its legend spreading far and wide. It became a local rite of passage to dare someone to stand on the porch at midnight. Few accepted, and fewer still claimed to have done it. Even the bravest souls couldn't explain the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to radiate from its walls. It wasn't just a house, it was a warning, a riddle, and perhaps a trap. A place where laughter wasn't a sound of joy but a harbinger of despair. And though the house had been silent for years, some claimed that if you stood at the end of Thornton Lane on a moonless night, you could still hear it. Faint laughter, carried on the wind, inviting you closer, closer and closer still. But Part 2, an irresistible challenge. James Parker leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the comments on his latest video. His fans loved his haunted explorations, but one comment caught his attention. "Bet you won't last an hour in the Laughing House. Prove you're not all talk." The Laughing House. The name sent a ripple of excitement down his spine. James had heard rumors about it before, a house so cursed even the bravest locals wouldn't step near it. Stories of disembodied laughter, shadowy figures, and the eerie disappearance of the Morgan family decades ago made it infamous. James wasn't just any content creator, he thrived on challenges. Haunted asylums, abandoned mansions, cursed forests, he'd seen it all. This house would just be another debunked legend. A quick search revealed layers of dark history. The Morgans, the most well-known residents, had vanished overnight, leaving behind only a cryptic message scrawled on their wall. "We're laughing now. Join us if you dare." Before them, The house belonged to Dr. Ambrose Heath, a psychiatrist infamous for his experiments on fear. Heath's patients disappeared one by one, and when authorities finally searched the house, all they found was his bloodied journal, filled with unsettling entries. The laughter, it calls to me. It's endless. James's followers flooded his live stream with encouragement and warnings as he announced his plan. All right, folks, this is it. Tomorrow night, I'm heading to the Laughing House. No gimmicks, no turning back. Let's see if it's as scary as they say. The following evening, James stood before the house, its silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. The air was unnaturally still, the kind that makes every sound feel louder. He adjusted his camera, addressing his audience with a confident grin. Here we go, the infamous Laughing House. Let's see what all the fuss is about. As he approached, the gate creaked open on its own. Okay, creepy start. Noted, he muttered, forcing a chuckle. The front door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was heavy and damp, carrying the faint metallic scent of rust or blood. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a grand but decaying living room. Dust-coated furniture stood untouched, and cobwebs draped every corner. His flashlight caught a painting on the far wall, the Morgan family portrait. The figures in the painting seemed normal at first glance, but as he stepped closer, their faces seemed off. Their smiles stretched unnaturally wide, their eyes glinting with something sinister. James swallowed hard. Classic haunted house vibes, loving the creepy artwork, he quipped to the camera. A sudden sound broke the silence, a faint, breathy laugh. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. Probably just the wind, he said, though his voice trembled. The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. It wasn't the joyful kind. It was hollow, distorted, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere. James gripped his camera tighter, forcing a smile for his viewers. All right, let's find out where that's coming from. As he stepped further into the house, the laughter grew, wrapping around him like a living thing. For the first time in his career, James felt the stirrings of real fear. Something about this place wasn't just eerie, it was alive, and it was watching him. James Parker sat in his dimly lit studio, scrolling through the avalanche of comments on his latest video. His audience loved his brand of fearless exploration into supposedly haunted locations, often challenging him to go deeper, darker, and bolder. But amidst the usual flood of emojis, jokes, and dares, one comment stopped him cold. The Laughing House. If you're as fearless as you claim, spend one night there. I dare you. He leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. The Laughing House. The name stirred something in his memory, a fleeting mention in a podcast, a blurry thread on Reddit. Its reputation was the stuff of legend, a house so cursed that even local ghost hunters refused to enter. Stories of laughter echoing in empty rooms, shadowy figures lurking in corners, and an unsettling history of people disappearing inside made it infamous. James couldn't resist a challenge like this. After all, he wasn't just another paranormal YouTuber. He was the guy. Someone who thrived on debunking myths and laughing in the face of fear. His followers knew that, and they loved him for it. This house could be his biggest coup yet. He began researching, diving headfirst into the labyrinth of the internet. The deeper he went, the darker the stories became. The Laughing House's notoriety centered on the Morgan family, who had vanished mysteriously over 3 decades ago. Edward Morgan, a renowned architect, had built the house for his family, designing it with intricate staircases and hidden passageways. But the perfect home soon turned into a nightmare. Neighbors reported strange occurrences, flickering lights in the dead of night, echoing laughter and shadows moving where no one should be. Then, one stormy night, the Morgans were gone. When authorities entered the house, they found everything left as if the family had stepped out for a moment. A fire smouldering in the hearth, plates on the table, and a chilling message scrawled across the living room wall. We're laughing now. Join us if you dare. The Morgans weren't the first victims. Before them, the house had belonged to Dr. Ambrose Heath, a psychiatrist with a fascination for fear. His experimental methods, immersing patients in their worst nightmares, were controversial, to say the least. His patients began disappearing one by one until only he was left. Eventually, Heath vanished too, leaving behind only his journal filled with cryptic and unnerving entries. The laughter, it grows louder, it wants more. James couldn't look away. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was the kind of story that could break the internet. He could already picture the thumbnail, "Surviving the Laughing House, the world's most cursed place." The next evening, James went live, addressing his audience with his trademark grin. "All right, guys, I've been reading your comments and it looks like you've got a new challenge for me. The Laughing House, the legend, the ultimate haunted hotspot. Well, guess what? Tomorrow night I'm going in. No tricks, no crew, just me, my camera and the truth. Let's see if it's as scary as they say." The live stream exploded with excitement and concern. His fans flooded the chat with a mix of encouragement and warnings. "Don't do it, James. That place is cursed. Bro, bring a priest. We believe in you, just don't laugh back." James dismissed the warnings with a wave. "Come on, guys, you know me. It's all just stories. Let's see what's real and what's not." That night, as he packed his gear, a small part of him wondered if this time might be different. But he quickly brushed it aside. Fear was just another trick the mind played. For James, tomorrow wasn't just another challenge, it was his next big victory. Or so he thought. Thornton Lane stretched out like a path into the unknown, the headlights of James Parker's car barely piercing the dense shadows of gnarled trees. The notifications on his phone buzzed non-stop, his followers flooding the live stream with a mix of excitement and warnings. "Don't go in there! The Laughing House is cursed, dude! Prove it's real, James!" James smirked, glancing at the camera. "All right, folks, this is it, the Laughing House. Let's see if it's more than just a scary story." As he approached, the house emerged from the darkness, its imposing silhouette bathed in pale moonlight. It was every bit as haunting as the stories claimed. Vines crawled up the weathered Victorian facade, and shattered windows stared out like hollow eyes. The air grew heavier as he pulled up to the rusted gate, cutting the engine. James stepped out, the cold night biting at him. His flashlight illuminated the path ahead, overgrown and lifeless. He hesitated at the gate, forcing a grin for the camera. "Here we go. No turning back now." The gate creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The overgrown path crunched under his boots, each step feeling heavier as the looming house seemed to grow taller, darker, more alive. Reaching the porch, James stopped. The door, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon him inside. The peeling paint and warped wood told of years of abandonment, yet the house felt anything but empty. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint stench of mold and decay. His flashlight beam swept over peeling wallpaper, cracked wooden floors, and furniture draped in dusty sheets. Every creak of the floorboards under his boots sounded unnaturally loud, as though the house were amplifying his presence. James glanced at the camera, forcing his voice to stay light. "So far, so spooky. Let's dig deeper." As he moved further in, the oppressive silence began to shift. Then he heard it, a faint, distant laugh. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it sent a chill down his spine. He froze, turning toward the sound. "That's probably just the wind," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. The laugh came again, louder now, echoing through the empty halls. James gripped his flashlight tightly, the confidence in his voice faltering. "All right, Laughing House, let's see what you've got." The darkness deepened, and the house seemed to breathe around him. Whatever lay ahead wasn't just watching, it was waiting. The door creaked shut behind James, the faint click of the latch echoing unnervingly. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. The heavy silence pressed against his ears, and the air inside was colder, heavier, carrying a strange metallic tang. He forced a grin for the camera. "All right, looks like the Laughing House doesn't want me leaving early." His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing an entryway with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and a staircase spiraling into shadow. Everything about the house felt frozen in time, yet unnervingly alive. To his left, a living room came into view. Dusty furniture sat draped in white sheets like ghostly figures standing guard. A rocking chair near the fireplace moved gently, the motion too steady to be random. James focused the camera on it. "Well, that's not creepy at all," he joked, his voice thin. The chair abruptly stopped. He froze, his pulse quickening, but quickly forced himself to move toward the staircase. The wooden steps creaked underfoot, and as he raised his flashlight, a shadow flickered at the top landing. James froze. What was that? The beam swept the darkness but found nothing. Shaking off the unease, he whispered, "Let's keep going." A faint humming sound lured him down a narrow hallway. The wallpaper here was darker, its floral patterns almost invisible under layers of grime. The air grew denser, as though the walls were closing in. His flashlight revealed claw-like scratches on the walls. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. James hesitated but pushed it open. Inside was a small sitting room, surprisingly intact. An antique piano stood against the far wall, and atop it lay a photo album. The album's pristine condition felt out of place. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The first photo was a family portrait, Edward and Margaret Morgan with their children, Jonathan and Emily. Their smiles were stretched unnaturally wide, and their eyes gleamed with unsettling sharpness. He flipped to the next page. The family no longer smiled. Their faces were blank, their eyes dark and empty. The next photo was worse. The family was scattered across a room, their faces twisted in terror. James slammed the album shut, his heart racing. A loud crash from above made him whip around. His flashlight flickered, struggling against the cold. "All right," he muttered nervously. "You've got my attention now." The sound came again, followed by the same hollow laughter he'd heard earlier. This time it was louder, reverberating from all around him. James backed out of the room, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The laughter abruptly stopped. A single creak echoed from the top of the stairs. James turned toward the staircase, his breath hitching. The darkness above seemed to thrum with a malevolent energy. He wasn't alone anymore. The silence in the laughing house was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the floor beneath James's boots. He stood at the base of the staircase, his flashlight casting trembling beams upward into the dark. He forced a grin for the camera strapped to his shoulder. "All right, folks, this is where most people would turn back, but not me." From above came a faint noise, a scuffing sound, like something dragging across the floor. James's forced bravado faltered. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely audible. The sound stopped. He swallowed hard, then began ascending the stairs, each step groaning underfoot. The upper landing emerged into view, revealing a hallway lined with doors, some closed and others slightly ajar. His flashlight illuminated scratched wallpaper and a frayed carpet that seemed untouched for decades. A rhythmic tapping sound broke the silence. It was coming from one of the open doors further down the hall. James hesitated, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Let's see what's making all the noise." As he neared the door, the tapping grew louder, irregular, like fingernails drumming against wood. James stepped inside the room, and the sound stopped instantly. The room was sparse. An old bed frame leaned against the wall, and a wardrobe stood in the corner with its doors slightly ajar. James shone his flashlight toward the wardrobe, pausing when the shadows within seemed to shift. "It's just the light," he muttered to himself, though his voice betrayed his unease. He reached out and pulled the wardrobe door open with a sharp tug. The space inside was empty except for a single hanger swaying gently. James exhaled in nervous relief. "All right, just my imagination." As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. In the doorway stood a shadowy figure, darker than the dim surroundings. It was still, featureless, and unblinking. "Who's there?" James demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. When he raised his flashlight, it vanished without a sound. James backed into the hallway, his breath quick and shallow. He spoke into the camera. "Did you see that? Someone tell me I'm not losing it." The live chat exploded with replies. "We saw it! Get out now! It's following you!" Suddenly, the tapping resumed, this time louder and more deliberate, echoing from farther down the hall. A faint whisper joined the noise, overlapping voices that grew more insistent with every step James took. The flashlight flickered as he approached the last door in the hall. Unlike the others, it was wide open, revealing a staircase descending into pitch-black darkness. James froze. He was certain that staircase hadn't been there earlier. A low creak emanated from the depths below, followed by an oppressive silence. He felt his feet move forward, drawn to the gaping maw of darkness. Standing at the top of the stairs, he aimed his flashlight downward, but the beam failed to illuminate anything beyond the first few steps. The air was colder here, heavy with a metallic tang. James forced a nervous laugh, his voice barely above a whisper. This is probably a mistake, but here goes. The first step groaned loudly as he descended, the sounds swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Behind him, the door creaked shut with a finality that sent shivers down his spine. James was no longer sure he could find his way back. James descended the staircase, his flashlight flickering as if struggling against the darkness. Each step creaked loudly, echoing through the suffocating silence. The air grew colder, carrying a damp metallic tang that made his stomach churn. When he glanced back, the door he'd come through had disappeared into shadow. "Great," James muttered, forcing a nervous laugh. "No turning back now." The live chat was frantic, with messages like, "Get out of there! James, something's behind you!" He froze at the last comment, glancing over his shoulder. The staircase behind him seemed impossibly long, stretching into the void. Taking a deep breath, he pressed on, descending into a damp stone corridor. The walls were slick, the space narrow and oppressive. His flashlight revealed jagged stone and warped wooden beams that seemed ready to collapse. A low thumping sound broke the silence. At first faint, it quickly grew louder, rhythmic like a heartbeat. James stopped, shining his light ahead. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. As he stepped forward, his boot struck something soft. He looked down and recoiled. A cracked porcelain doll lay on the ground, its glass eyes staring unblinkingly at him. "Okay, no. This is straight out of a horror movie." The flashlight flickered, plunging him into momentary darkness. In that brief void, he heard shuffling, followed by faint whispers behind him. When the light returned, the corridor was empty. "You're losing it, James," he muttered, trying to convince himself it was nothing. The whispers grew louder as he moved further, overlapping voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. His flashlight caught movement ahead, a shadow darting into a side passage. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. There was no response, only the return of the rhythmic thumping, now louder and accompanied by faint, distorted laughter. Against his better judgment, James followed the shadow into the side passage. The air grew colder, his breath visible in the faint light. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, their jagged lines glowing faintly as if alive. The laughter echoed, high-pitched and unnatural, setting his nerves on edge. The passage opened into a circular chamber. The walls were covered in more glowing symbols, and in the center stood an old wooden chair bolted to the floor. Chains dangled from its arms, swaying gently in the still air. James approached cautiously, the camera capturing every detail. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered. As he circled the chair, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely. James frantically smacked it, panic mounting as he stood in complete darkness. When the light sputtered back to life, he froze. The chair was no longer empty. A figure slumped in it, its head bowed. Matted hair obscured its face, and the chains rattled as it stirred. Slowly, its head lifted, revealing hollow, blackened eyes that seemed to devour the light. A guttural voice echoed through the chamber, impossibly loud and deep. "Why have you come?" James staggered back, his mind racing. Shadows began to swirl at the edges of the room, growing taller and closing in. The whispers turned into a chorus of screams, drowning out his thoughts. "I'm done! I'm leaving!" he shouted, scrambling for the passage. But the figure in the chair let out a bone-chilling laugh, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing the light entirely. For a moment, James felt the world collapse around him. Then his own scream filled the void. Part 4.1, The House's Grasp. James stumbled through the dark forest, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his breath shallow and ragged. He had escaped the laughing house, or so he thought. But something felt off. The night air, once refreshing, now felt suffocating, as though the house's grasp had never truly loosened. The distant outline of the house loomed behind him like a shadow, its presence lingering in his mind. He stopped in a clearing, hoping to regain his bearings. The house was behind him, yet the faint, eerie echoes of its laughter still clung to the air, twisting through the trees. His heart raced, and he could feel the weight of his own unease pressing down on him. "Just keep moving," he whispered to himself, shaking off the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. His hands fumbled for his phone, and he found the cracked screen still functioning. He tapped at it, desperate to reach anyone who might still be watching. The live feed had gone dead, just static. His stomach turned, a feeling of isolation settling over him. He had no connection, no way to communicate with the outside world. A message finally appeared. "We saw what happened. Are you okay?" James breathed a sigh of relief. At least someone had seen the broadcast. He quickly typed a reply. "I don't know. Something's wrong. I can feel it. The house, it's not done with me." Almost immediately, the response came back. "What do you mean?" James stared at the words, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. The sensations of the house, the whispers, the oppressive air, it was as if the house was still pulling at him, even from afar. He glanced back toward the woods, the darkness swallowing everything beyond. A faint glimmer of light caught his eye, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Something's pulling me back. I can't explain it." Without thinking, his feet moved, drawn to the woods once again. Despite every instinct screaming for him to run, he couldn't resist. The pull was undeniable, as if the house itself had sent a part of its darkness to follow him. He stumbled into the trees, the underbrush crunching beneath his feet. The air around him felt dense, thick with unseen pressure. As he moved deeper, he stepped on something wet. Looking down, he saw bloodstains leading deeper into the forest. Panic surged through him. He tried to turn back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He had to keep moving forward. His phone buzzed again, the message screen flashing. "James, stop. You're not alone. We're sending help." But the words didn't reach him. He barely even processed them before his gaze returned to the dark trail, the blood-stained path that led to the Laughing House. The distant, faint glow of the house's windows seemed to beckon him. "No, I can't go back." But his body betrayed him. His legs carried him forward through the dense woods toward the sinister glow. The house loomed ahead, its windows now flickering with that unsettling, unnatural light. It stood like a silent sentinel, waiting for him. James paused just outside the door. The wind had stopped entirely, and the world seemed to hold its breath. His hand reached for the door, which creaked open as though it had been expecting him. A chill swept through him, and the faintest echo of laughter rang in his ears. "This is insane," James whispered, but he stepped through the threshold anyway. The door slammed shut behind him with an ominous finality. He was back. The Laughing House had never let him go. The walls seemed to close in, the laughter grew louder, and the darkness wrapped itself around him once again. Part 4.2, The House's Hunger. James stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. The air inside the Laughing House felt thick, as if the house itself were waiting for him. He had tried to escape, but it had drawn him back, its grip still strong. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing clearer as he stepped further in. They were familiar, twisted voices that echoed in the walls. "Come closer," they whispered. "You're ours." His skin crawled, and his mind screamed to turn around, but his feet refused to listen. The house was alive, watching him. Every step he took felt like a mistake. As he ventured deeper, the shadows seemed to stretch out in unnatural ways, making the hallways feel endless. He stumbled, his breath catching in his throat. "What's happening?" he muttered, his pulse racing. He reached for his phone, but it slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The moment he touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through him, causing him to recoil. The screen flickered erratically, showing distorted faces and figures standing in the shadows. He dropped it, panic rising. The house was playing tricks on him, warping reality. Every sound, every flicker of light felt like a warning. A creak behind him made him freeze. Slowly he turned. The door he had entered through had closed, leaving only darkness behind him. The air felt suffocating, and the unmistakable sound of scratching came from the walls. "Who's there?" he called out, voice shaky. No answer. The scraping sound grew louder, more deliberate. His legs moved, but he couldn't run. The hallways twisted around him, shifting and rearranging. The house had him in its grasp. Then the laughter started. Louder this time, more frantic, echoing from every corner. It was in his head, seeping into his thoughts. "No, please." James gasped, trying to cover his ears, but the laughter wouldn't stop. It was inside him now. He dropped to his knees, trembling. The house was alive and it was hungry. The voices came closer, circling around him. "You belong to us now," they hissed. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating him. He looked up and saw a figure in the corner of the room, tall, thin, its face an unrecognizable blur of shadows. Its eyes were hollow, its smile grotesque. It stepped forward, the laughter growing louder with each movement. James scrambled back. "Stay away!" he shouted, panic overtaking him. But the figure was faster. It lunged, and everything went black. When James regained consciousness, he was back in the center of the house. The chains hung from the ceiling, the symbols glowing faintly on the walls. The whispers were louder now, consuming him. "You're never leaving," the voice said, clear as day. James's heart sank. The house had claimed him. There was no escape. It had drawn him back, fed on his fear, and now he was part of it. The laughter echoed in his mind, unending. The house would never let him go. Part 5, the final laugh. James staggered through the endless corridors of the laughing house, the air thick with dread. The laughter, once distant, now echoed inside his mind, growing louder with each step. No matter how far he ran, the house was always just behind him, watching, feeding on his terror. His body felt heavy, drained by the house's suffocating presence. The floor beneath him creaked as he moved, but the house didn't let him escape. It seemed to twist and shift with every corner, warping his perception of time and space. "What is this place?" he muttered. "Why can't I leave?" A voice answered from the shadows, a low, guttural whisper. "You were never meant to leave," it crooned. "The house claims all who enter. You belong to us now." His chest tightened. He had known it, but hearing the words aloud was worse. The house was feeding on his fear, drawing him in, and there was no way out. In desperation, he tried to run again, but the corridors twisted around him. The walls seemed to close in as he moved, the house reshaping itself, making sure he couldn't escape. "Stop running," the voice hissed. "It's useless. You're already ours." James reached the room where it all started. The chains hung from the ceiling, the strange symbols glowing on the walls. It felt like time had collapsed, trapping him in a nightmarish loop. "No!" he gasped, realizing he was trapped. "I can't be here again." The laughter surged, growing louder, filling the room. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head in pain. "Please," he pleaded, "let me go." But the house didn't answer. The walls pressed in closer. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, with hollow, dark eyes. They surrounded him, their presence suffocating. Their laughter joined in a twisted harmony, as if feeding off his fear. One figure stepped forward. Its face was a mask of shadows, its eyes empty. It reached out, placing a cold hand on his forehead. "You were never meant to leave, James," it whispered. "You belong to the house now." James gasped, feeling his body go numb. The darkness closed in and his mind slipped away. The laughter grew, a deafening crescendo, until he could no longer hear or feel anything. He was consumed, lost to the house forever. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the house all was still. The doors and windows were sealed tight. The house had claimed its latest victim, and the cycle would begin again. The house waited, its hunger never ending. The end.